Hello, friend. Welcome. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe deeply. Let the tensions of your day begin to fade like fog in morning sunlight. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time, back to 1943, to the middle of World War II, to a converted English manor house that served as a military hospital far from home. This is a story about two people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Eleanor Walsh, a young nurse from Massachusetts with auburn hair and green eyes full of determination. And James Sullivan, Sully to everyone who knew him, a pilot with the 8th Air Force, with kind eyes and a smile that could light up even the darkest days of war. Their story isn't about love at first sight, though there was certainly a spark when they met. It's about something deeper, something that grows slowly in the soil of shared struggle. It's about two people who chose each other day after day through separation and fear, through the uncertainty of war and the promise of peace. This is a story about letters that crossed oceans, about faith that sustained two hearts when everything tried to tear them apart, about healing, not just from physical wounds, but from the deeper wounds that war leaves on the soul. As you listen, let yourself sink deeper into rest. There's no need to stay awake for every word. This story will be here, wrapping around you like a warm blanket, whether you're listening or drifting into dreams. Let the gentle rhythm of the narrative carry you somewhere peaceful, somewhere safe. Imagine England in 1943. Rolling green countryside, old stone manor houses, the sound of bomber engines overhead. A world at war, yes, but also a world where ordinary people found extraordinary courage, where nurses worked through exhaustion to save lives, where pilots flew into danger, knowing each mission might be their last, where love bloomed anyway, stubborn and beautiful, refusing to be extinguished by darkness. This is the story of Eleanor and Sully, of a nurse who saved a wounded pilot's life, and how he, in turn, saved hers in ways she never expected. Of two souls who found each other across the chaos of war and held on through everything that came after. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow. Imagine the sound of rain on old windows, the smell of antiseptic and tea, the feeling of being far from home, but finding something like home in another person's eyes. Let yourself drift back to April 1943, to an English countryside hospital, to the moment when a young nurse first saw a wounded pilot and felt something shift in her heart. This is The Nurse and the Pilot, a World War II love story to fall asleep to. In the spring of 1943, in a small coastal town in Massachusetts, there lived a young woman named Eleanor Walsh. She was 23 years old, with auburn hair that she kept pinned neatly beneath her nurse's cap, and green eyes that held both kindness and determination in equal measure. Eleanor had grown up in that coastal town, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper and a schoolteacher. She'd always been drawn to helping others, to healing, to making things better. When she turned 18, she'd enrolled in nursing school in Boston, studying long hours, working hard, dreaming of the day she could make a real difference in the world. The war changed everything, as wars do. By 1942, Eleanor had graduated and was working at the local hospital when the call came for nurses to serve overseas. The military needed medical personnel desperately. Nurses who could work in field hospitals near the front lines, who could handle the chaos and trauma of wartime medicine, who could bring comfort to young men far from home and facing unimaginable horrors. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She signed up immediately, much to her parents' distress. Her mother cried and begged her to reconsider. Her father, understanding his daughter's determination, simply held her close and told her to be careful, to come home safe. By March of 1943, Eleanor found herself in England, stationed at a military hospital in the countryside outside of London. The hospital was housed in an old manor house that had been converted to handle the wounded, soldiers coming back from bombing raids over Germany, from skirmishes across the Channel, from training accidents and illness, and all the 1,000 ways that war broke young bodies. The work was hard, harder than anything Eleanor had experienced in her training. The hours were long, often 16 or 18 hours at a stretch, when casualties came in heavy. The wounds were terrible. Burns from aircraft fires, shrapnel injuries, broken bones, infections, trauma that would wake her in the night, even when she was too exhausted to dream. But Eleanor found purpose in it. She moved through the wards with quiet efficiency, checking bandages, administering medicines, holding the hands of boys who cried for their mothers, writing letters home for those who couldn't hold a pen themselves. The other nurses became her family, sisters bound together by shared exhaustion and shared purpose. It was on a rainy afternoon in late April when she first saw him. Eleanor was in the receiving area when an ambulance pulled up, bringing in wounded from a bomber that had crash-landed on its return from a mission. The crew had survived, but most were injured. She helped unload the stretchers, doing quick assessments, prioritizing who needed immediate surgery, who could wait, who just needed rest and care. One of the last men off the ambulance was walking on his own, though he had a nasty gash on his forehead and his flight jacket was torn and burned. He was tall, with dark blonde hair and blue eyes that were sharp and alert, despite the obvious pain he was in. "I'm fine," he said when Eleanor approached him with her medical bag. "The other guys are worse. Take care of them first." Eleanor gave him a stern look, the one she'd perfected over months of dealing with stubborn soldiers who thought admitting injury was somehow admitting weakness. "Sit down," she said firmly, pointing to a chair. "You're bleeding all over my floor." And I'm going to clean that wound, whether you like it or not. He blinked, surprised by her tone, then slowly smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said, sitting obediently. Eleanor cleaned the wound on his forehead, working carefully, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion she'd been fighting all day. It was a deep cut, but clean, and would heal well with proper care. "What's your name?" she asked as she worked. "Captain James Sullivan," he said. "But everyone calls me Sully. I'm a pilot with the 8th Air Force." "Well, Captain Sullivan," Eleanor said, beginning to stitch the wound, "you're lucky. This looks worse than it is. You'll have a scar, but you'll live." "That's good to know," he said, and there was something in his voice, humor mixed with genuine relief. "I'd hate to have survived the crash just to die of infection in a hospital." Eleanor finished the stitches and bandaged his forehead. "There," she said. "Keep it clean and dry. Come back in 3 days to have it checked. And if you start running a fever or see any redness, come back immediately." "Yes, ma'am," Sully said, again, standing. He wavered slightly, and Eleanor instinctively reached out to steady him. "Are you dizzy?" she asked, concerned. "A little," he admitted. "Hit my head pretty hard in the crash." Eleanor's professional instincts kicked in immediately. "You might have a concussion. You need to stay here for observation, at least overnight." "I need to get back to my base," Sully protested. "My crew!" "Your crew is being taken care of," Eleanor said firmly. "And you're no good to them if you collapse and crack your skull open. You're staying, Captain. That's an order." He looked at her for a long moment. Then that slow smile returned. "I like you, nurse." "Walsh," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Walsh." "I like you, Nurse Walsh. You're bossy." "I preferred decisive," Eleanor replied. But there was a hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Come on, let's get you to a bed." She led him to the ward where they kept patients for observation. Men with concussions, minor injuries, those recovering from surgery. She settled Sully into a bed and did a thorough neurological exam, checking his pupils, his reflexes, asking him questions to assess his mental state. "You seem lucid enough," she said finally, "but I want you to rest. No getting up without help, and someone will check on you every few hours tonight." "Will that someone be you?" Sully asked, and there was something in his tone, not quite flirting, but interested, curious. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Possibly," she said professionally. "Now rest, Captain." She moved on to her other patients, but she found her thoughts drifting back to the pilot with the blue eyes and the easy smile. There was something about him, a warmth, a humor, even in pain, that drew her attention in a way that surprised her. Eleanor prided herself on her professionalism. She'd seen hundreds of soldiers come through the hospital, and she treated them all with the same care and compassion. But she'd never felt particularly drawn to any of them, never felt that spark of connection beyond nurse and patient. But with Captain Sullivan, with Sully, there was something different. She checked on him throughout the evening, along with her other patients. Each time, He was awake and alert, and each time he'd say something that made her smile despite herself. A joke about the hospital food, a comment about how the English rain never seemed to stop, a question about where she was from, what had brought her overseas. Massachusetts, she told him during one check. A little town on the coast. My father's a lighthouse keeper. No kidding. Sully's face lit up. I'm from Connecticut. Not far at all. Small world. Very small, Eleanor agreed. Do you miss it? He asked. Home, I mean. Eleanor paused, considering. Every day, she said honestly. I miss the ocean, the sound of the waves, the way the light looks at sunset over the water, the smell of my mother's cooking, my father's terrible jokes. She smiled softly. But I'm needed here. This is where I can do the most good. Sully nodded slowly. That's exactly why I'm here too, he said. I could have stayed stateside, trained new pilots, but the fight's here, and I want it to be part of it. To do something that matters. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt that connection again, stronger this time. A recognition of kindred spirits. Two people who'd left everything familiar to serve something larger than themselves. You should rest, she said gently. No more talking tonight, Captain. Sully, he said. Please, call me Sully. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Rest, Sully. The next morning, Eleanor was exhausted. She'd worked through the night, catching only a few hours of sleep in the nurses' quarters before returning to the ward. But when she came to check on Sully, she found him sitting up in bed, looking much better, reading a battered paperback someone had left behind. Good morning, Nurse Walsh, he said cheerfully. I'm happy to report no dizziness, no nausea, no unusual symptoms. I think I'll live. Eleanor did another examination, checking his wound, his pupils, asking him the standard questions. Everything looked good. He'd been lucky. The concussion was mild, and he was recovering well. You can return to your base, she said, but take it easy for a few days. No flying until a doctor clears you. Understood, Sully said. He stood, testing his balance, then reached for his jacket. Thank you, Nurse Walsh, for taking care of me, for being bossy. Eleanor smiled, despite herself. You're welcome, Captain. He started to leave, then paused at the door of the ward and turned back. Would it be terribly inappropriate, he asked, if I came back to visit you sometime? Not as a patient, just as someone who'd like to get to know you better? Eleanor felt her heart skip. She should say no. There were rules about fraternization, about maintaining professional boundaries. She should be focused on her work, not on pilots with blue eyes and easy smiles. But instead, she heard herself say, I'm off duty on Wednesday afternoons, usually from 2 to 6. Sully's face broke into a genuine, delighted smile. Wednesday afternoon, he said. I'll be here. And then he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the ward, wondering what she'd just agreed to, and surprised to find that she was looking forward to Wednesday more than she'd looked forward to anything in a long time. The days until Wednesday passed in their usual blur of work and exhaustion. Eleanor tended to her patients, assisted in surgeries, wrote letters home for soldiers who couldn't write themselves, held the hands of dying boys, and told them they were brave, they mattered, that they wouldn't be forgotten. But in the quiet moments, in the brief pauses between crises, she found herself thinking about Sully, about his smile, his humor, the way he'd looked at her with such interest and warmth, about the fact that he was from Connecticut, not far from her own home, about the connection she'd felt, unexpected and undeniable. Wednesday arrived, gray and drizzly as most days in England seemed to be. Eleanor finished her morning shift, changed out of her uniform into a simple dress and cardigan, and went to the hospital's small library, where staff sometimes gathered during their time off. She sat by the window with a book, though she couldn't seem to focus on the words. What if he didn't come? What if he'd forgotten, or been sent on a mission, or simply changed his mind? What if... Nurse Walsh. She looked up, and there he was, Sully in his uniform, his cap under his arm, the bandage gone from his forehead, but a fresh pink scar visible above his right eye. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, slightly wilted, but clearly picked with care. "Hi," he said, suddenly looking shy. "I wasn't sure what was appropriate, but I saw these growing by the side of the road and thought, well, they reminded me of spring back home." Eleanor stood, taking the flowers, touched by the simple gesture. "They're lovely," she said. "Thank you. Would you like to take a walk?" Sully asked. "It's not raining for once, and I thought we could talk, get to know each other properly." Eleanor nodded, finding a glass to put the flowers in before following him outside. They walked through the grounds of the manor house, past the gardens that someone still tried to maintain despite the war, down a path that led to a small pond surrounded by trees. The afternoon was cool, but pleasant, and for a little while, it was easy to forget there was a war on, that young men were dying, that the world was tearing itself apart. They talked easily, naturally. Sully told her about growing up in Connecticut, about his family, a father who owned a small bookshop, a mother who taught piano, 2 younger sisters who wrote him letters full of gossip and news from home, about how he'd always loved flying, how he'd learned in a rickety biplane at a local airfield, how joining the Army Air Forces had felt like destiny. Eleanor told him about the lighthouse, about growing up with the constant sound of the ocean, about her mother's insistence that she learn to read the weather, her father's patient teaching about tides and stars, about nursing school in Boston, about the moment she decided to volunteer to serve overseas. "Weren't you scared?" Sully asked. "Coming over here, into a war zone?" "Terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but more scared of staying home, safe. While people were suffering and I could help, I couldn't live with that." Sully nodded. "I understand that completely," he said. "Every time I fly a mission, I'm scared. Anyone who says they're not is lying. But the fear doesn't matter as much as the purpose." They reached the pond and sat on a weathered bench beneath an old oak tree. The water was still and gray, reflecting the cloudy sky, but peaceful in its own way. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said after a moment of comfortable silence. "Anything," Sully replied. "What was it like? The crash, I mean. You seemed so calm when you came in, but that must have been terrifying." Sully was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the pond. "It was," he said finally. We'd taken heavy flak over the target, and one engine was on fire. We were losing altitude, and I knew we weren't going to make it all the way back to base. But I had my crew to think about. 9 other men whose lives depended on my decisions. So I pushed the fear down, focused on flying, on finding a place to put her down. He paused, swallowing hard. We hit hard. The landing gear was damaged, so we belly landed in a field. The aircraft broke apart, and there was fire and smoke. And for a minute, I thought we were all done for. But then we were outside, all of us accounted for, all alive. Banged up, but alive. He turned to look at Eleanor. And then you were there, bossy and efficient and taking no nonsense. And I remember thinking, I'm going to be okay. We're all going to be okay. You made me feel safe, Eleanor. In that moment, when everything was chaos, you were solid and calm and exactly what we needed. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. That's my job, she said softly. To make people feel safe. To help them heal. You're very good at it, Sully said. He reached over and took her hand, gently, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his, and they sat there, holding hands by the pond. 2 people finding something unexpected in the middle of a war. That afternoon marked the beginning of something neither Eleanor nor Sully could have predicted. In a world of chaos and death and uncertainty, they found each other. And in finding each other, they found hope. The kind of hope that makes even the darkest days bearable. There was much ahead for them. Challenges and separations, fear and uncertainty. But for now, in this peaceful moment by the pond, there was just the 2 of them, holding hands, beginning a story that would carry them through the war and beyond. The weeks that followed their first afternoon together took on a pattern that both Eleanor and Sully came to treasure. Whenever Sully's flight schedule allowed, whenever Eleanor had time off from the hospital, they would meet. Sometimes they walked through the countryside, exploring the narrow lanes and hedgerows of rural England. Sometimes they sat in the hospital library, reading side by side in comfortable silence. Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Eleanor learned that Sully was 26 years old, 3 years older than her. That he'd wanted to be a pilot since he was 10 years old and saw a barnstormer perform at a county fair. That he wrote poetry, though he was shy about sharing it. That he had a terrible singing voice, but loved music anyway. That he was afraid of spiders, which made Eleanor laugh until she cried. Sully learned that Eleanor was the oldest of 3 children, with 2 younger brothers who were also serving. One in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific, one in the Army in North Africa. That she'd wanted to be a doctor, but nursing school was all her family could afford. That she collected seashells and still carried one in her pocket from the beach near her lighthouse home. That she could be fiercely stubborn when she believed she was right, but also incredibly gentle when gentleness was needed. They were careful to be discreet. The other nurses knew, of course, Nothing stayed secret in the close quarters of the hospital. But they were kind about it, covering for Eleanor when Sully came to visit, smiling knowingly when Eleanor hummed while working. The head nurse, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who'd served in the Great War, pulled Eleanor aside one day. "I know about the pilot," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. "Just be careful, Walsh. Don't let it interfere with your work. And don't get your heart broken. These flyboys, they take risks every day. You understand what I'm saying?" Eleanor understood perfectly. Every time Sully flew a mission, every time his bomber took off headed for Germany, there was a chance he wouldn't come back. The statistics were brutal. Bomber crews had some of the highest casualty rates in the war. Every mission was dangerous. Every return was a small miracle. "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "But I care about him, Mrs. Pemberton. I can't help that." The older woman's face softened slightly. "No," she said, "you can't help who you care about. Lord knows I tried to tell myself that same thing in the last war, and it didn't work then either. Just be prepared, Walsh. That's all I'm saying." Eleanor tried to follow that advice. She tried to keep her heart guarded, to remind herself that this might be temporary, that war took everything and gave nothing back. But it was impossible. Every time she saw Sully, every time he smiled at her or took her hand or looked at her with those blue eyes full of warmth and something deeper, she fell a little more. And Sully was falling too. She could see it in the way he looked for her in crowds, in the way his face lit up when she appeared, in the way he talked about the future. Not if, but when the war was over, when they could go home, when they could build a life together. It was in late May, on a warm evening unusual for England, that Sully first told her he loved her. They were sitting by their pond, watching the sunset paint the water gold and pink. Eleanor had just finished a brutally long shift, 36 hours straight, dealing with casualties from a major bombing raid. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but being with Sully made everything feel bearable. "I was thinking," Sully said, his arm around her shoulders, "about after the war, about what I want to do." "Tell me," Eleanor said, leaning against him. "I want to go back to Connecticut," he said. "Maybe take over my father's bookshop eventually. It's small, but it's a good business, and I've always loved books. I could see myself there, organizing shelves, recommending stories to customers, being part of the community." He paused, then continued, his voice softer. "And I want a family, a wife who's strong and smart and kind, children we can raise to be good people, a house with a garden where we can grow vegetables and flowers, Sunday dinners with both our families, ordinary, peaceful days." Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. "That sounds wonderful," she said quietly. Sully turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his expression was serious, vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said, "I'm talking about you. I want all of that with you. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you. I'm in love with you." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd known, of course, on some level. But hearing him say it, hearing the certainty in his voice, made it real, made it impossible to deny or protect herself from. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I can't help it. I love you, Sully." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet. And for that moment, the war disappeared. There was only the two of them, the sunset, the pond, and the promise of a future they both desperately wanted. But the war had a way of intruding on even the most perfect moments. June came, and with it, increased activity at the airbase. Missions became more frequent, more dangerous. The Allied forces were preparing for something big. Everyone could feel it, though no one knew exactly what. Sully flew mission after mission, returning exhausted, sometimes wounded, always grateful to be alive. Eleanor saw the toll it was taking on him. The shadows under his eyes grew darker. His hands sometimes trembled when they held his coffee. He started having nightmares. She could tell from the way he looked in the mornings, hollow and haunted. He never complained, never spoke about the specific horrors he witnessed, trying to protect her from the worst of it. Then, on June 6, 1944, everything changed. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. The hospital erupted into controlled chaos as casualties began pouring in, not just from the beaches, but from the airborne drops, from the bomber missions supporting the invasion, from the fighter planes providing cover. Eleanor worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, barely eating, moving from patient to patient in a fog of exhaustion and determination. Burns, shrapnel wounds, gunshot wounds, amputations, infections. The stream of broken bodies seemed endless. In the midst of it all, she worried about Sully. His squadron had been flying constant missions in support of the invasion. She hadn't seen him in over a week, hadn't heard any news. Every time an ambulance arrived, she scanned the faces, terrified she'd see him among the wounded. Or worse, that she'd hear his name from someone delivering bad news. Finally, on the 4th day after the invasion, during a brief lull in the arrivals, Eleanor stepped outside for fresh air. She was leaning against the wall of the manor house, her eyes closed, trying to will away the exhaustion, when she heard footsteps. Eleanor. Her eyes flew open. Sully stood there, still in his flight suit, covered in dirt and grease, and what might have been blood. He looked terrible, exhausted beyond words, his face gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed, but he was alive. He was there. Eleanor didn't remember moving. One moment, she was against the wall. The next, she was in his arms, holding him tight, feeling him shake as he held her just as tightly. "I'm okay," he murmured into her hair. "I'm okay. We made it. All of us made it." They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, grateful beyond words for this small miracle, that they were both alive, both here, both safe for at least this moment. "I have 24 hours leave," Sully said finally, pulling back to look at her. "I came straight here. I needed to see you, to know you were all right." "I'm all right," Eleanor said, though she knew she looked as terrible as he did. "Tired, but all right. Come with me," Sully said suddenly. "I found a place, a little inn in the village. It's not much, but it's quiet, away from all this. Come rest with me, please. Eleanor knew she should say no. She was needed at the hospital. There were patients to care for, wounds to dress, surgeries to assist with. But Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway as if summoned. "Go, Walsh," the head nurse said, her voice gentler than Eleanor had ever heard it. "You've been here 4 days straight. You need rest." "We can manage for 24 hours. Eleanor looked at her gratefully, then back at Sully. "All right," she said. "Let me change and grab a few things." 20 minutes later, they were walking through the village, hand in hand, toward a small inn with ivy growing up its stone walls. The innkeeper, an elderly woman who asked no questions, showed them to a simple room with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking a garden. Sully cleaned up first, washing away the grime of 4 days of constant flying. Eleanor did the same, scrubbing her hands and face, changing into a clean dress she'd brought. When they were both clean and the door was closed, they simply held each other, standing in the middle of the small room. "I was so scared," Sully admitted, his voice breaking. "Flying those missions, seeing planes go down all around us, and all I could think was that I might never see you again, that I might die without telling you how much you mean to me." "I was scared too," Eleanor said. "Every time an ambulance arrived, I was terrified it would be you, that I'd have to treat you, or worse, you'd already be gone." They moved to the bed, lying down fully clothed, just holding each other. The exhaustion they'd both been fighting for days finally caught up with them, and they slept, wrapped in each other's arms, safe for these precious hours. When Eleanor woke, it was dark outside. Sully was awake too, watching her, his fingers gently tracing patterns on her arm. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she replied, smiling. "What time is it?" "A little past midnight," Sully said. "We slept about 8 hours." Eleanor stretched, feeling more rested than she had in days. "That's the most sleep I've gotten in nearly a week." "Me too," Sully said. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made Eleanor's heart clench. "What is it?" "The invasion is the beginning of the end," Sully said. "We all feel it. The Allies are pushing forward, establishing a foothold in France. It's going to be a long, hard fight, but we're winning. We're actually going to win this war." "That's good news," Eleanor said, carefully, sensing there was more. "It is," Sully agreed, "but it also means the fighting is going to intensify. More missions, more danger. And Eleanor, I need you to know that I might not make it to the end. The odds aren't great for bomber crews. Every mission could be the last one." Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes, but she forced them back. "Don't say that," she whispered. "I have to say it," Sully said gently, "because I need you to know something. If something happens to me, if I don't make it, I need you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life, that you made this war bearable. That loving you gave me a reason to fight, to survive, to come back from every mission. You've been my light in all this darkness, Eleanor." Now the tears did fall, sliding down Eleanor's cheeks. "You're going to make it," she said fiercely. "You have to make it. We're going to have that life you talked about. The bookshop, the house with the garden, the family. We're going to have all of it." "I hope so," Sully said, wiping away her tears. "God, I hope so. But if we don't, if something happens..." "Nothing is going to happen," Eleanor interrupted, her voice stronger now. "I won't let it. Do you hear me, James Sullivan? You're going to survive this war. You're going to come home. And we're going to build that life together." Sully smiled despite his fears, despite everything. "When you use my full name like that, I almost believe nothing could touch me." "Believe it," Eleanor said, "because I do. I have faith in you, in us, in the future we're going to have." They held each other through the night, talking quietly, making plans, holding on to hope. They talked about the bookshop, about what they'd name it, about the house they'd buy, how many children they wanted, about introducing their families to each other, about the wedding they'd have when the war was over. They talked until the sky began to lighten, until Sully's 24 hours were nearly up and he had to return to base. As they walked back through the village in the early morning light, Eleanor felt both lighter and heavier than before. Lighter because she'd had this time with him, this respite from the war. Heavier because she knew he was going back to danger, to missions that might claim his life. At the hospital gates, they stopped. Sully cupped Eleanor's face in his hands, looking at her with such intensity it took her breath away. "I'm coming back to you," he said. "I promise. No matter what happens, I'll find my way back." "I'll be waiting," Eleanor promised, "however long it takes." They kissed, one last time, and then he was gone, walking away toward the road where he'd catch a ride back to base. Eleanor watched until he disappeared from sight, then took a deep breath and turned back to the hospital. Her patients needed her. The war went on, and somewhere out there, Sully was fighting to survive, fighting to come back to her, fighting for the future they'd promised each other. Eleanor would wait, she would work, she would hope, and she would believe with everything she had that love was strong enough to survive even this. The summer of 1944 stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and danger. But Eleanor and Sully had found something precious in the midst of war, a love that gave them both strength, hope, and a reason to believe in tomorrow. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be trials and fears and moments of despair, but they would face them together in spirit, if not in body, holding on to the promise they'd made to each other. The summer of 1944 was both the longest and shortest of Eleanor's life. Days blurred together in an endless cycle of work. Wounded soldiers arriving in waves, surgeries that lasted hours, bandages that needed changing, medicines that needed administering, letters that needed writing for men who couldn't hold a pen. But through it all, Eleanor held on to the memory of those 24 hours with Sully. The way he'd held her, the promises they'd made, the future they'd planned. It became her anchor, the thing that kept her going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Sully wrote when he could. Letters arrived sporadically, sometimes 3 in 1 week, sometimes none for 2 weeks. But each one was precious, filled with his thoughts and feelings and hopes. He wrote about missions, though always vaguely, never giving details that might frighten her. He wrote about his crew, the men he flew with who'd become his brothers. He wrote about small moments, a beautiful sunset seen from the air, a surprisingly good meal in the mess hall, a joke someone had told that made everyone laugh. And always, he wrote about coming home, about the life they build together, about loving her more with each passing day. Eleanor kept every letter, tied with a ribbon, stored in a small box under her bed. She read them during her rare quiet moments, drawing strength from his words, from the knowledge that he was out there, fighting, surviving, thinking of her. July brought sweltering heat, unusual for England. The hospital became even more uncomfortable, the wards stuffy and close. But the work continued without pause. The Allied forces were pushing deeper into France, and the casualties kept coming. It was mid-July when Eleanor met another nurse who would become a dear friend. Her name was Grace Chen, a Chinese-American woman from California, quick-witted and sharp-tongued, with a gift for making even the most difficult patients smile. Grace and Eleanor were assigned to the same ward, working night shifts together, and they quickly bonded over shared exhaustion and dark humor that helped them cope with the horrors they witnessed daily. "You have a pilot, don't you?" Grace asked one night as they organized supplies. "I've seen you reading letters." Eleanor felt herself blush. "I do. His name is Sully. He flies bombers." Grace nodded knowingly. "I have one too. Fighter pilot, named Ray. He's from California, like me. We met when he came in with a broken arm after his plane got shot up." She smiled, though there was sadness in it. "It's terrifying, isn't it, loving someone who could die any day?" "It is," Eleanor admitted, "but I wouldn't change it. Loving him, even with the fear, is better than not loving him at all." "I feel the same way," Grace said quietly. Then, with forced brightness, "When this war is over, we'll have to introduce them. Have a double wedding or something." Eleanor smiled at the thought. "That sounds perfect." The friendship with Grace made the difficult days more bearable. They covered for each other, supported each other through the worst shifts, shared their fears and hopes during stolen moments of rest. August arrived, and with it came news that lifted everyone's spirits. Paris had been liberated. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. The end of the war felt closer, more possible than it had in years. Sully managed to get a 2-day pass in late August, and Eleanor got time off to meet him. They spent those precious hours walking through the English countryside, talking, planning, simply being together. Sully looked tired but hopeful, more optimistic than Eleanor had seen him in months. "We're winning," he told her as they sat beneath a tree, sharing sandwiches Eleanor had brought. "Really winning. The Germans are retreating. It might be over by Christmas." "Do you really think so?" Eleanor asked, almost afraid to hope. "I do," Sully said. He took her hand, looking at her seriously. "Eleanor, when this war is over, when we're both home safe, will you marry me?" Eleanor's heart stopped. They talked about the future, about building a life together. But this was the first time he'd actually asked. "Are you proposing to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Sully said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. Simple, silver, with a tiny blue stone. "I know it's not much. I bought it from a jeweler in the village. But Eleanor Walsh, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." Sully slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They held each other, laughing and crying at the same time, giddy with joy and hope, and the promise of a future that finally felt within reach. "When the war is over," Sully said, "I'm taking you home. We'll get married in your father's lighthouse if you want, or in my father's bookshop, or anywhere you choose. And then we'll start our life together, properly, with no more war, no more separations, no more fear." "I can't wait," Eleanor said, looking at the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. They spent the rest of those 2 days in a bubble of happiness, making detailed plans for their wedding, for where they'd live, for everything. When they had to part again, it was with the certainty that this was temporary, that the end was in sight, that their forever was waiting just beyond the war. September and October passed in continued hard work and continued hope. The Allies were pushing into Germany itself. Victory seemed inevitable, though still hard-won and costly. Then came November, and everything changed. Eleanor was in the middle of a shift when the ambulances started arriving. So many ambulances. A major operation had gone wrong, and casualties were pouring in faster than the hospital could handle them. Burned men, men with missing limbs, men screaming in pain, men silent with shock. Eleanor worked mechanically, doing triage, sending the worst cases to surgery, stabilizing who she could. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, but inside she was screaming, exhausted beyond measure, desperate for this to stop. Then she heard a name that made her blood run cold. "Captain Sullivan," someone said. "Bomber pilot. He's in bad shape." Eleanor's world narrowed to a single point. She moved through the chaos, pushing past other nurses and doctors until she found him. Sully was on a stretcher, unconscious, his face covered in soot and blood. His left leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle. Burns covered his arms and chest where his flight jacket had caught fire. He was breathing, but it was shallow, labored. "Sully," Eleanor breathed, her professional composure cracking. "Sully, I'm here." One of the doctors was already assessing him. "He needs surgery immediately," he said. "That leg and possible internal injuries. We need to move him now." Eleanor wanted to go with him, to hold his hand, to tell him everything would be all right. But there were other patients who needed her, and she was needed here. So she watched as they wheeled him away, her heart breaking, her hands shaking. Grace found her a few minutes later, standing frozen in the receiving area. "Eleanor," she said gently, I heard. He's in the best hands. Dr. Morrison is the best surgeon we have. Eleanor nodded numbly, then forced herself to move, to get back to work. But every moment was torture, wondering how Sully was, whether he would survive, whether the man she loved was fighting for his life, just rooms away. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Eleanor worked through all of it, tending to other patients, but her mind was always with Sully, praying, hoping, begging whatever higher power existed to let him live. Finally, Dr. Morrison emerged from the surgical ward. He looked exhausted, his scrubs stained with blood, but his expression was cautiously optimistic. "Nurse Walsh," he said, knowing about their relationship. Everyone knew by now. He made it through. The leg was badly broken, but we said it. The burns are serious, but not life-threatening. He has some cracked ribs and a concussion, but he's alive, and if infection doesn't set in, he should recover. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery, still unconscious from the anesthesia, but yes, you can sit with him." Eleanor found Sully in a bed in the recovery ward, pale and still, his left leg in a cast, bandages covering his arms and chest. She pulled a chair beside his bed and took his hand carefully, mindful of the burns. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here, Sully. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay." She sat there through the night, holding his hand, watching him breathe, grateful for every rise and fall of his chest. Grace brought her coffee and a sandwich at some point, squeezing her shoulder in silent support. As dawn broke, Sully's eyes finally fluttered open. He looked confused at first, disoriented. Then his gaze found Eleanor and focused. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Don't try to talk," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe. You're at the hospital. You had surgery, but you're going to be okay." Sully's hand tightened slightly around hers. "My crew," he managed. Eleanor's heart sank. She'd been so focused on Sully, she hadn't thought to ask about the others. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'll find out. Just rest now. Please, just rest." Over the next few days, Eleanor learned the full story. Sully's bomber had been hit by anti-aircraft fire over Germany. They'd limped back toward England, but the damage was too severe. Sully had kept the aircraft in the air long enough for most of the crew to bail out over Allied territory, but the co-pilot and the tail gunner had been killed in the initial hit. Sully himself had stayed with the plane, trying to save it, until it was too late to bail out safely. He'd crash-landed in a field, and the plane had caught fire. He'd been pulled from the wreckage by farmers who'd seen him go down. He was lucky to be alive, but the guilt of losing 2 of his crew members weighed on him heavily. Eleanor saw it in his eyes when he woke, heard it in the way he talked about the crash. He blamed himself, even though everyone told him he'd saved the rest of the crew by keeping the plane in the air as long as he did. They were just kids. Sully said one evening, staring at the ceiling. 20 years old, both of them. They had families waiting for them, and I couldn't save them. You saved 7 others, Eleanor said gently. 7 men who are alive because of you. Because you stayed with that plane, kept it flying when anyone else would have bailed out. It doesn't feel like enough, Sully said, his voice breaking. Eleanor climbed carefully into the bed beside him, mindful of his injuries, and held him as he cried for the men he'd lost, for the weight of command, for the toll this war had taken on him. The weeks that followed were difficult. Sully's physical injuries healed slowly but steadily. The leg would take months to fully recover, and he'd walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. The burns left scars on his arms and chest, but the deeper wounds, the emotional ones, took longer to heal. The doctors determined that Sully wouldn't fly again. His injuries were too severe, and psychologically, he'd been through too much. He would be sent home as soon as he was well enough to travel. Eleanor felt torn. She was grateful he'd be safe, that he'd be out of danger, but it also meant they'd be separated. She still had months left on her nursing commitment, and he'd be going home to Connecticut while she stayed in England. "Come with me," Sully said one evening as they sat together in the hospital garden. It was December now, cold and gray, but they both needed the fresh air. "Come home with me. We can get married. Start our life together now, instead of waiting." Eleanor wanted to say yes more than anything, but she shook her head. "I can't," she said softly. "I have 6 more months on my contract. These soldiers need nurses, Sully. I can't just leave." "I know," Sully said, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. "I know, and I love that about you. Your dedication, your sense of duty. But God, Eleanor, I don't want to leave you here." "It's only 6 months," Eleanor said. Those 6 months felt like an eternity, and the war is almost over. By the time my contract is up, it might all be done. And then I'll come home, and we'll get married, and we'll have that life we planned. Sully pulled her close, careful of his healing ribs. 6 months, he said. "I can do 6 months if I know you're coming home to me at the end of it." "I promise," Eleanor said, looking at the ring on her finger. 6 months, and then I'm yours forever. They spent every moment they could together before Sully's departure in mid-December. He was being sent home on a hospital ship, along with other wounded who were well enough to travel. Eleanor helped him pack his few belongings, making sure he had everything he needed. The morning he left was bitterly cold, with frost covering the ground. Eleanor walked with him to the transport that would take him to the port, holding his hand, trying to memorize everything about this moment. "Write to me every day," Sully said. "Tell me everything. What you're doing, what you're thinking, how you're feeling. Your letters are what will keep me going." "I will," Eleanor promised. "And you write to me too. Tell me about home, about your family, about the bookshop. Help me picture the life I'm coming home to." At the transport, they held each other one last time. Sully kissed her, long and deep, a kiss full of promise and longing and love. "6 months," he said against her lips, "and then you're mine forever." 6 months, Eleanor agreed. I love you, Sully. I love you too, he said, more than anything in this world. And then he was climbing into the transport, and it was pulling away, and Eleanor was standing there, watching it disappear down the road, her heart feeling like it was being torn in two. Grace came up beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. You'll be okay, she said. You both will be. 6 months is nothing. Eleanor nodded, wiping her tears. 6 months, she repeated, like a mantra. I can do 6 months. She turned back toward the hospital, toward the work that still needed doing, toward the patients who needed her care. Sully was safe, headed home, out of danger. That was what mattered. And in 6 months, she'd follow him, and they'd start the life they'd been dreaming of. 6 months. It seemed both impossibly long and somehow manageable. Eleanor would work, would serve, would finish her commitment, and then she'd go home to the man she loved, and their real life would begin. Winter settled over England, cold and dark. Eleanor threw herself into her work, counting down the days until her contract would end and she could go home. She wrote to Sully every night, and his letters came back regularly, full of news about his recovery, his family, the bookshop, the life waiting for her. The war was winding down. Victory felt closer every day, and Eleanor held on to hope that she'd make it through these last months, that she and Sully would finally be together, that their love would carry them through to the other side. Winter in England was gray and cold, the kind of damp chill that settled into your bones and never quite left. But Eleanor barely noticed. She moved through her days in a rhythm that had become second nature. Morning rounds, changing bandages, administering medications, assisting in surgeries, writing letters for soldiers who couldn't write themselves. And every evening, without fail, she wrote to Sully. His letters arrived with comforting regularity now that he was stateside. The mail was faster, more reliable. He wrote about the long ship journey home, about seeing the Statue of Liberty as they sailed into New York Harbor, and how he'd cried, actually cried, at the sight of home. He wrote about reuniting with his family, his mother, who'd wept and held him for what felt like hours, his father, who'd shaken his hand and then pulled him into a fierce hug, his sisters, who talked over each other in their excitement to tell him everything he'd missed. He wrote about physical therapy for his leg, about the slow process of healing, about learning to walk without a limp. He wrote about visiting the bookshop, about how his father wanted to start teaching him the business, preparing for the day Sully would take it over. He wrote about the house he'd found, a small place with a garden just outside of town that he thought would be perfect for them. And always, in every letter, he wrote about missing her, about counting the days until she'd come home, about the wedding they'd have, the life they'd build, the future that was finally, blessedly within reach. Eleanor kept every letter, tied with the same ribbon as before, adding to the growing collection. She read them during her breaks, drawing strength from his words, from the knowledge that he was safe, recovering, waiting for her. Grace's pilot, Ray, had been shot down in January. He'd survived, been captured, and was in a POW camp somewhere in Germany. Grace carried on with quiet determination, but Eleanor saw the fear in her friend's eyes, the way she checked the casualty lists obsessively, hoping for news. "He's alive," Eleanor would tell her. "You have to hold on to that. He's alive, and when this war ends, he'll come home." "I know," Grace would say, but her voice was hollow, and Eleanor understood. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. January became February. The news from the front was good. The Allies were pushing deeper into Germany. The end truly was in sight now. But the casualties kept coming, and the work never stopped. Eleanor celebrated her 24th birthday in early February with a small cake Grace had managed to procure from somewhere, and a letter from Sully that arrived on the exact day. He'd enclosed a pressed flower, a crocus, one of the first signs of spring, and written about how he couldn't wait to celebrate her next birthday together, properly, as husband and wife. March arrived with the first hints of spring. The days grew longer, warmer. Flowers began to bloom in the hospital gardens, and the war news grew better with each passing day. Then, on April 12th, devastating news arrived. President Roosevelt had died. The entire hospital seemed to go into mourning. This man, who'd led them through the Depression and through most of the war, who'd been a constant presence for so many years, gone. Eleanor wrote to Sully that night, sharing her grief and shock. His letter back was equally somber, but also contained a thread of hope. "Roosevelt didn't live to see the end of the war," Sully wrote, "but his legacy will. We're so close now, Eleanor, so close. He knew we'd win. We're going to finish what he started." 2 weeks later, the news they'd all been waiting for finally came. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. VE Day, May 8th, 1945. The hospital erupted in celebration. Nurses and doctors and patients who could move were laughing, crying, hugging each other. Someone found a radio and turned it up loud, and music filled the wards. Church bells rang throughout the countryside. People poured into the streets of the nearby village, celebrating the end of the nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 years. Eleanor found herself in the garden, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming gratitude that it was finally over. Grace found her there and pulled her into a fierce hug. "It's over," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "It's really over. Ray can come home. We can all go home. We can go home," Eleanor repeated, the words feeling almost unreal. "Grace, I can go home." Her contract ended in just 3 more weeks. 3 weeks, and she'd be on a ship headed for America, headed for Sully, headed for the life they'd dreamed about through all those dark months. The time seemed to crawl and fly simultaneously. Eleanor worked her final shifts with a bittersweet mix of emotions. She was ready to go home, desperate to see Sully again. But she'd also grown to love these people she'd served with. The other nurses who'd become like sisters, the doctors who'd taught her so much, even the patients, each one a reminder of why she'd come here in the first place. Mrs. Pemberton, the stern head nurse, pulled Eleanor aside on her last day. "You did good work here, Walsh," she said, her voice gruff but warm. "You saved lives. You made a difference. Don't forget that." "I won't," Eleanor promised, hugging the older woman. "Thank you for everything you taught me." Grace was being transferred to the Pacific Theater. The war with Japan was still ongoing, and nurses were desperately needed there. They said their goodbyes the night before Eleanor was to leave, both crying, promising to write, hoping that Ray would be found safe and that they'd see each other again someday. "Go marry your pilot," Grace said, holding Eleanor's hands. "Be happy. Live the life we all fought for." "I will," Eleanor promised. "And you be safe. Come home when it's all over. Promise me." "I promise," Grace said, and they hugged one last time. The journey home took 2 weeks. Eleanor sailed on a transport ship, along with dozens of other nurses and soldiers who'd been wounded and were being sent home. The crossing was rough at times, but Eleanor barely noticed. She spent the time on deck when she could, watching the endless ocean, thinking about Sully, about home, about everything that awaited her. She'd sent Sully a telegram before leaving, telling him when she'd arrive in New York. He'd written back immediately. He'd be there, waiting at the dock, ready to take her home. The morning they sailed into New York Harbor, Eleanor stood at the railing, watching as the city came into view. The Statue of Liberty rose green and majestic against the blue sky, and Eleanor understood why Sully had cried at the sight. She was home. After 2 years away, through all the horror and exhaustion and fear, she was finally home. The ship docked, and the process of disembarking seemed to take forever. Eleanor gathered her few belongings, a small bag of clothes, her letters from Sully tied with ribbon, a few small mementos from England, and joined the line of people waiting to leave the ship. Finally, she stepped onto American soil. The dock was chaos, soldiers reuniting with families, people crying and laughing and holding each other. Eleanor scanned the crowd, searching, her heart pounding. And then she saw him. Sully stood near the edge of the dock, leaning slightly on a cane, his eyes searching the crowd. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there before. But he was there. He was real. He was hers. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sully's face broke into a huge smile. He started moving toward her, and Eleanor dropped her bag and ran, pushing through the crowd, not caring about propriety or dignity or anything except reaching him. They collided in the middle of the dock, and Sully caught her, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her off her feet despite his injured leg. Eleanor was crying and laughing and saying his name over and over. And Sully was doing the same, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "You're here," he said into her hair. "You're really here. I can't believe you're here." "I'm here," Eleanor said, pulling back to look at his face, to touch his cheek, to make sure he was real. "I'm home. I'm with you." Sully kissed her then, right there on the dock, with hundreds of people around them. And Eleanor kissed him back with everything she had. 2 years of fear and separation and longing poured into that kiss. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "I love you," Sully said. "God, I missed you so much." "I missed you too," Eleanor said. "I love you. I love you so much." They stood there, holding each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Sully picked up Eleanor's bag with one hand and kept his other arm around her. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home. My parents are waiting. They're so excited to meet you." They took a train to Connecticut, sitting close together, hands intertwined, unable to stop touching, unable to stop looking at each other. Sully told her about his leg. It was healed now, mostly, though it ached in cold weather and he'd always have a slight limp. About his therapy, his wake at the bookshop, the house he'd bought. Eleanor told him about her final months in England, about VE Day, about Grace and the other nurses, about how she'd counted down every single day until she could come home to him. "When do you want to get married?" Sully asked, as the countryside rolled past the train window. Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger, the one he'd given her in England, that she'd worn through everything. "As soon as possible," she said. "I don't want to wait anymore. We've waited long enough." "Next week," Sully suggested, grinning. "That gives us time to get a license. Let my parents prepare. Wire your parents so they can come. Is next week too soon?" "Next week is perfect," Eleanor said, and she meant it. They'd been apart for 6 months. She'd been overseas for 2 years. She'd spent the war healing others, while her heart ached for this man. She didn't want one more day of waiting. Sully's family home was warm and welcoming, full of love and laughter. His mother cried when she met Eleanor and immediately pulled her into a hug. His father shook her hand solemnly and thanked her for her service. His sisters, Margaret and Ruth, both in their early 20s now, embraced her like she was already family. "We've heard so much about you," Margaret said, smiling. "Sully never stops talking about you. We were starting to wonder if you were real." "I'm real," Eleanor said, laughing. "And I've heard so much about all of you. I feel like I already know you." That evening, they called Eleanor's parents from the telephone in the bookshop. Her mother sobbed with joy to hear Eleanor's voice, to know she was home safe. Her father's voice was gruff with emotion as he told her how proud he was of her. They were overjoyed about the wedding and would take the train down from Massachusetts immediately. The next week passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Eleanor and Sully got their marriage license. His mother and sisters helped Eleanor find a simple white dress. They arranged for the ceremony at the small church where Sully had grown up. They sent telegrams to friends, made plans for a small reception at Sully's parents' house. Eleanor's parents arrived 3 days before the wedding. Her mother couldn't stop hugging her, touching her face, making sure she was real. Her father held her for a long time, not saying anything, just holding his daughter, who'd been so far away for so long. They met Sully and immediately loved him. Her father approved of his character, his obvious devotion to Eleanor. Her mother cried happy tears watching them together. Seeing the love between them that was so clear and strong. Eleanor's brothers couldn't make it. They were still serving, still overseas, but they sent telegrams of congratulations and love. "Marry him," her brother David wrote from the Pacific. "Anyone who waited for you like he did is a keeper." The night before the wedding, Eleanor's mother helped her press her dress and pin up her hair for a trial run. They sat together in the room where Eleanor was staying at the Sullivan house, and her mother took her hands. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "What you did during the war, the lives you saved, the courage you showed. But I'm also so happy you're home, that you found someone who loves you the way Sully does. You deserve this happiness, Eleanor. You've earned it." "Thank you, Mama," Eleanor said, tears in her eyes, "for everything. For raising me to be strong, for letting me go, even though it scared you, for supporting me through all of it." They held each other, mother and daughter, grateful beyond words that they both survived the war, that they were here together, that Eleanor had found her way home. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, a perfect June morning. Eleanor woke early, butterflies in her stomach, hardly able to believe that today was the day. After everything, the war, the separation, the fear, the waiting, today she would marry Sully and become his wife. Her mother and Sully's sisters helped her dress. The white dress was simple but elegant, with small buttons down the back and lace at the sleeves. Someone had found orange blossoms for her hair, and Margaret wove them into Eleanor's auburn curls. Ruth let her borrow a pearl necklace that had belonged to Sully's grandmother. When Eleanor looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy, radiant, full of hope. Not like the exhausted nurse who'd spent 2 years in a war zone, but like a young woman on her wedding day, ready to start her life. The church was small and filled with flowers. Sully's family and friends filled the pews, along with Eleanor's parents and a few neighbors from home who'd made the trip. It wasn't a large wedding, but it was perfect. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, but her eyes were only for Sully. He stood at the altar, in his best suit, watching her approach, and the look on his face, the love, the joy, the absolute certainty, took her breath away. When she reached him, he took her hand, and they turned to face the minister together. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows clearly, firmly, looking into each other's eyes. "I, James, take you, Eleanor, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Sully said, his voice strong. "I promise to love you, to cherish you, to stand by you through whatever life brings us. You saved me during the war, in more ways than one, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Eleanor's turn came, and she spoke from her heart. I, Eleanor, take you, James, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, to support you, to build a life with you, full of joy and peace. You gave me hope when I needed it most. You gave me a reason to come home, and I promise to choose you every day for all the days of our lives. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Sully kissed her, the small church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, smiling so wide it hurt, holding hands, ready to start their forever. The reception was joyful and full of laughter. They cut a small cake, danced to music from the radio, celebrated with everyone they loved. But the most precious moment came later, when Sully and Eleanor finally drove away to the small house he'd prepared for them, their first home together. It was modest. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and yes, a garden that was already growing vegetables and flowers. But to Eleanor, it was perfect, because Sully was there, because it was theirs, because after so much darkness, they'd found their way to light. The house that Sully had found was everything he promised. Small but charming, with white clapboard siding and green shutters. It sat on a quiet street just outside the center of town. The garden in back was already flourishing, with tomatoes, beans, lettuce, and flowers, roses and daisies and sunflowers that turned their faces to follow the sun. Their first night there, Sully carried Eleanor over the threshold, both of them laughing, trying not to bump into the door frame. They stood in the small living room, looking around at their home. The furniture Sully had carefully collected over the past months, the curtains his mother had made, the pictures already hanging on the walls. It's perfect, Eleanor said, turning to face him. Sully, it's absolutely perfect. You're perfect, he replied, pulling her close. I can't believe you're really here, that we're married, that this is our life now. They spent that first week simply being together, learning the rhythms of married life. Sully would wake early and make coffee, bringing a cup to Eleanor in bed. She'd cook breakfast while he read the newspaper. They'd work in the garden together in the mornings, tending the plants, pulling weeds, planning what else they might grow. In the afternoons, Sully would go to the bookshop to work with his father, learning the business. Eleanor would clean the house, write letters to her parents and to Grace, explore their new town. And in the evenings, they'd sit together on the small porch, talking about their days, making plans, simply enjoying the peace of being together. It wasn't always easy. Sully still had nightmares sometimes, waking in the night, gasping, reaching for Eleanor in the darkness. His leg ached in damp weather, making him irritable, and there were moments when the memories would overwhelm him, when a loud noise would make him flinch, when he'd go quiet and distant, lost in thoughts of missions and men who hadn't made it home. Eleanor understood. She had her own struggles, flashbacks to the hospital, to the worst injuries she'd seen, to the men she'd lost, despite her best efforts. Sometimes she'd wake crying, confused about where she was. Sometimes the smell of antiseptic would transport her back to the wards, and she'd have to sit down and breathe through the panic. But they helped each other. When Sully had nightmares, Eleanor would hold him and talk softly until he came back to himself. When Eleanor's memories overwhelmed her, Sully would take her hands and remind her where she was, who she was, that the war was over and they were safe. "We're going to be okay," became their mantra. "We survived the war. We can survive this too." And slowly, day by day, they healed. The nightmares came less frequently. The triggers became less intense. They learned to talk about what they'd been through, sharing the weight of their experiences so neither had to carry it alone. By August, Eleanor was feeling restless. She loved being a wife, loved creating a home with Sully. But she missed nursing, missed the sense of purpose, of making a difference. She mentioned this to Sully one evening as they sat on the porch. "I'm not bored," she said carefully. "I love our life, but I feel like I should be doing more, using my training, helping people." Sully took her hand, understanding immediately. "The hospital in town is always looking for nurses," he said. "Maybe you could work there, part-time if you want, or full-time, whatever feels right to you." Eleanor felt a wave of relief and love. "You wouldn't mind?" "Mind," Sully said, his voice full of conviction. Sully shook his head. "Eleanor, I fell in love with you while you were working yourself to exhaustion, taking care of wounded soldiers. Your compassion, your dedication, that's part of who you are. I'd never want you to give that up." The next week, Eleanor applied at the local hospital. They hired her immediately. Experienced nurses were still in short supply, and her wartime service made her more qualified than most. She started part-time, 3 days a week, and found that the work filled something in her she hadn't realized was empty. The patients were different. Mothers having babies, children with broken arms, elderly people with chronic conditions. But the core of it was the same: helping, healing, easing suffering. Eleanor was good at it, and it felt right. September brought news that made Eleanor cry with relief and joy. A letter arrived from Grace. She was safe, stationary in the Philippines, now that the war with Japan had ended in August. Ray had been found. He'd survived the POW camp and was recovering. They were getting married as soon as Ray was well enough, probably sometime in October. "I wish you could be here," Grace wrote, "but I know you're building your life with Sully." "I'm so happy for you, Eleanor. You deserve every bit of happiness. Ray and I will come visit when we're back stateside. I want to meet this pilot of yours properly, as your friend, not your coworker." Eleanor wrote back immediately, sending her congratulations and love, promising that yes, they would absolutely visit once Grace and Ray were home. October brought cooler weather and the brilliant colors of autumn. Sully officially became a partner in his father's bookshop, Sullivan and Son Books. The new sign read. He loved the work, loved recommending books to customers, loved the quiet peace of being surrounded by stories instead of bombs and death. Eleanor found herself settling into their life with deep contentment. Work at the hospital was fulfilling. Her marriage to Sully was everything she dreamed of and more. They'd made friends in town, other young couples, some of them also veterans, trying to build normal lives after the war. In November, Eleanor realized she'd missed her monthly cycle. Then another week passed, and another. She went to see Dr. Harrison, the kindly old physician at the hospital, and he confirmed what she'd already suspected. She was pregnant. Eleanor sat with the news for a day, letting it sink in before telling Sully. She wanted to find the right moment, the right way. Finally, one evening after dinner, as they sat in their living room by the fire, she took his hand. "Sully," she said, her heart racing, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, immediately attentive. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Eleanor said, smiling. "Better than fine, actually. Sully, we're going to have a baby." She watched the news register on his face. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, and then a huge smile spread across his features. "A baby?" he said, his voice full of wonder. "Eleanor, we're going to have a baby?" "We are," she confirmed, laughing as he pulled her into his arms. "When?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. "Dr. Harrison thinks late June or early July," Eleanor said. "A summer baby." Sully whooped with joy, standing and spinning her around, then immediately setting her down carefully. "Should I be doing that? Is it safe? Are you feeling okay? Do you need anything?" Eleanor laughed at his sudden concern. "I'm fine. I'm healthy. The baby is fine. We're both fine." That night, they lay in bed talking about the future. In concrete terms now. A baby. Their baby. They'd need to convert the spare bedroom into a nursery. They'd need to buy a crib, diapers, all the things a baby needed. They argued playfully about names. Sully wanted James Jr. if it was a boy. Eleanor thought that was too predictable. If it was a girl, Eleanor liked Catherine, after her grandmother. "We're going to be parents," Sully said, wonder in his voice. "We survived a war, found each other, got married, and now we're bringing a new life into the world. It's like everything we went through was leading to this. It was worth it," Eleanor said softly. "Every hard moment, every scary moment, every moment of waiting and hoping. It was all worth it to get here." The months of Eleanor's pregnancy passed peacefully. Winter came, and Sully made sure Eleanor stayed warm and comfortable. He hovered sometimes, overly protective, but Eleanor found it endearing rather than annoying. This man, who'd flown bombing missions over Germany, was nervous about his wife carrying their child. Eleanor continued working at the hospital through her first 2 trimesters, finally stopping in April when she became too uncomfortable. The other nurses threw her a small baby shower, giving her hand-knitted blankets and booties, advice and encouragement. Sully worked on the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow, since they didn't know if they were having a boy or girl. His father made a beautiful wooden cradle. His mother sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Eleanor's mother sent a package of baby things she'd saved from when Eleanor and her brothers were small. In early May, Grace and Ray visited. Grace looked wonderful, happy, healthy, married to a kind man who clearly adored her. Ray and Sully hit it off immediately, swapping stories about flying and finding common ground. The 4 of them spent a wonderful weekend together. 2 couples who'd found love in the middle of war, now building peaceful lives. "You're glowing," Grace told Eleanor as they sat in the garden while the men talked inside. "Pregnancy agrees with you." "I feel good," Eleanor said, one hand on her swollen belly. "Tired, and this baby likes to kick my ribs, but good, happy." "I'm so glad we both made it here," Grace said, taking Eleanor's hand. "That we both found good men, that we survived, that we get to have this normal lives, families, peace." "Me too," Eleanor said, squeezing her friend's hand. "After everything, we earned this." June arrived hot and humid. Eleanor was uncomfortable, restless, ready for the baby to come. She couldn't sleep well, couldn't get comfortable no matter how she positioned herself. Sully tried to help, bringing her cold compresses, rubbing her swollen feet, reading to her in the evenings. The baby arrived on July 2nd, 1946. Just over a year after Eleanor had come home from the war. The labor was long and difficult, but Eleanor had faced down worse things than childbirth. And when she finally held her daughter, because it was a girl, pink and squalling and perfect, she felt like every hard thing she'd ever endured had been leading to this moment. "Catherine," she said, looking at Sully, who was crying as he looked at his daughter. "Catherine Grace Sullivan, after my grandmother and after Grace, who helped me survive the war." "It's perfect," Sully said, carefully taking the baby. "She's perfect. You're perfect. God, Eleanor, we have a daughter." Little Catherine was healthy and strong, with a good set of lungs that she used frequently in those first weeks. Eleanor and Sully adjusted to parenthood with the same determination they'd brought to everything else, learning as they went, supporting each other through the exhaustion and confusion, marveling at every tiny thing their daughter did. Sully was a devoted father from the start. He'd wake for middle-of-the-night feedings, walking Catherine around the house while Eleanor got some sleep. He'd change diapers without complaint, talk to Catherine constantly, even though she couldn't understand him, hold her for hours while she slept on his chest. Eleanor watched him with their daughter and fell in love with him all over again. This man who'd faced death and come home, who'd waited for her, who'd built this life with her. Now he was a father, gentle and patient and full of love. As summer turned to autumn, and Catherine grew from a newborn to an infant who smiled and cooed and grabbed at everything, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 years ago, she'd been in England, caring for wounded soldiers, wondering if Sully would survive the war. 2 years ago, she'd been counting down the days until she could come home. 1 year ago, she'd been newly married, still healing from the trauma of war. And now, she was here, in her home, with her husband and daughter, living the peaceful life they dreamed about in those dark days. It wasn't always easy. Catherine was a demanding baby. Sully's leg still bothered him. Eleanor still sometimes had flashbacks to the hospital wards. But it was theirs, hard-won and precious. One evening in October, after Catherine had finally fallen asleep, Eleanor and Sully sat on their porch together. The air was cool, the leaves brilliant with autumn color, the world peaceful and quiet. "Do you ever think about the war?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Sometimes," Sully admitted. "Less than I used to." "You?" "Less than I used to too," Eleanor said. "But I'm glad we went through it, in a strange way. Not glad for the war itself, for all the death and suffering, but glad that it brought us together, that it taught us what really matters." "What really matters," Sully repeated, taking her hand. "This, you, me, Catherine, family, home, peace. The ordinary moments that seemed so impossible during the war. We earned this," Eleanor said, the same thing Grace had said to her months ago. "We survived, we held on, we found our way home. And now we get to live. Really live. Not just survive." Sully pulled her closer, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out, listening to the sounds of their quiet neighborhood, grateful beyond words for the gift of ordinary days. Inside, Catherine slept in her cradle. In the bookshop in town, shelves waited for Sully to stock them tomorrow. At the hospital, patients would need Eleanor's care when she returned to work part-time next month. Their families would visit for Thanksgiving in a few weeks. Life would continue, ordinary and extraordinary, precious because they'd come so close to losing it. "I love you," Sully said into the darkness. "Thank you for waiting for me, for coming home, for building this life with me." "I love you too," Eleanor replied. "Thank you for surviving, for keeping your promise, for being exactly who you are." They sat there long after the stars were fully out. Two people who'd found each other in war and built a life together in peace, holding on to the happiness they'd fought so hard to find. The years ahead would bring more children, more challenges, more joys and sorrows. But Eleanor and Sully would face them together, just as they'd faced everything else. Their love, forged in the darkness of war, would prove strong enough for whatever life brought them. For now, in this moment, they had everything they dreamed of, and that was more than enough. The years unfolded like the pages of a well-loved book, each one adding to the story of Eleanor and Sully's life together. Catherine was joined by a brother, Michael, in 1948, and another daughter, Anne, in 1951. Their small house became filled with the sounds of children, laughter and arguments, crying and singing, the patter of small feet running through rooms, the slam of screen doors as kids rushed outside to play. Sully took over the bookshop completely when his father retired in 1955. He expanded it, adding a children's section that became the heart of the store. Kids would come in after school and sit on the floor reading, and Sully would recommend books to them the way he once recommended flight paths to his co-pilot. He became a fixture in the community, known for his kindness, his knowledge, and the way he'd always take time to help someone find exactly the right book. Eleanor continued nursing, moving from the hospital to become a school nurse in the early 1950s. She loved working with children, teaching them about health, bandaging skinned knees, calling worried mothers when fevers spiked. She was good at it, patient and warm, but also no nonsense when needed. Students would come back years later and tell her she'd made a difference, that they remembered her kindness. The nightmares and flashbacks from the war faded over the years, but never completely disappeared. Sometimes Sully would wake in the night, reaching for Eleanor, needing to know she was there. Sometimes Eleanor would smell antiseptic and be transported back to the hospital in England, to the endless parade of wounded boys. But they'd learned to live with these echoes of the past, to comfort each other through them, to recognize them for what they were, scars that had healed, but would always be visible. They talked to their children about the war, but carefully, age appropriately. Catherine grew up knowing her father had been a pilot, her mother a nurse, that they'd met because of the war. But Sully and Eleanor didn't dwell on the horror of it. They focused instead on the courage they'd witnessed, the friendships they'd made, the way ordinary people had done extraordinary things. War is terrible, Sully told his children more than once. Never forget that. But sometimes good people have to fight against evil. And sometimes, in the middle of terrible things, you find the most precious gifts. He'd always look at Eleanor when he said this, and she'd smile, understanding. Grace and Ray settled in California and had 3 children of their own. The two couples visited each other whenever they could, maintaining the friendship forged in war. Their children grew up calling each other cousins, even though they weren't related by blood. Every few years, they'd all vacation together, renting a house by the ocean, spending long days on the beach, the adults talking late into the night while the children slept. "We're lucky," Grace said during one of these visits. In the summer of 1960, they were sitting on a porch overlooking the Pacific, watching the sun set over the water. "We made it through. We found good men. We built good lives. We are lucky," Eleanor agreed. But we also worked for it. We didn't take it for granted. No, Grace said softly. We never took it for granted. The 1960s brought change and challenge. Catherine went to college, then came home with a boyfriend who wore his hair long and protested the Vietnam War. Sully struggled with this at first, his daughter dating someone who seemed to reject everything he'd fought for. But Eleanor reminded him gently that they'd fought so their children could have the freedom to question, to protest, to think for themselves. She's not rejecting you, Eleanor told him. She's exercising the freedom you protected. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Sully thought about this for a long time and eventually came to understand. He and Catherine's boyfriend, David, had long conversations about war and peace and duty. They didn't always agree, but they respected each other. And when Catherine married David in 1968, Sully walked her down the aisle with pride, knowing his daughter had chosen someone who challenged her, who made her think, who loved her fiercely. Michael followed a different path. He became a doctor, inspired by his mother's stories of healing and helping, and became a teacher, inheriting her father's love of books and learning. All three children grew into good people, thoughtful, kind, committed to making the world better. The 1970s brought grandchildren. Catherine had twins, Emma and Jack. Michael had a daughter, Sarah. Anne had two sons, Thomas and James, named after Sully and his father. Eleanor and Sully's house became a gathering place again, filled with young voices, sticky hands, endless questions. Sully would read to his grandchildren from the books in his shop, doing all the voices, making them laugh. Eleanor would teach them to garden, to recognize birds, to bandage scraped knees properly. They were in their element as grandparents, old enough to be patient, young enough to get down on the floor and play. This is what we fought for, Sully said one Sunday afternoon, watching their grandchildren play in the backyard while their own children talked and laughed on the porch. This exact thing, family, peace, children growing up safe and free. It was worth it, Eleanor said, taking his hand. Every hard moment, every scary moment, all of it was worth it to get here. The bookshop continued to thrive, even as shopping malls and chain stores arrived in town. Sullivan and Son Books became an institution, a place where people came not just for books, but for community, for conversation, for connection. Sully hired local teenagers to work there, teaching them about customer service and literature and the value of honest work. Eleanor retired from nursing in 1985 at the age of 65. The school threw her a huge party, and former students came from all over to thank her, to tell her how she'd impacted their lives. Sully watched her receive this outpouring of love and felt his heart swell with pride. This remarkable woman who'd served in a war, who'd raised 3 children, who'd spent 40 years caring for others. She'd made such a difference in the world. Sully himself retired from the bookshop in 1990 at 73, finally ready to slow down. He handed the business over to Michael's daughter Sarah, who'd always loved books as much as he did. Sullivan and Son became Sullivan and Granddaughter, and Sarah modernized it carefully, adding a coffee shop and hosting book clubs and author events, keeping the heart of it the same while adapting to changing times. The 1990s were peaceful years. Eleanor and Sully traveled back to England to see the places where they'd met and served. The Old Manor House Hospital was a private school now, but they walked the grounds, stood by the pond where Sully had first told Eleanor he loved her. They visited the American Cemetery in Cambridge, paid respects to the men who hadn't made it home, left flowers, and said quiet prayers. They went to Massachusetts, to Eleanor's lighthouse, which was now automated, but still standing. They walked on the beach, where Eleanor had played as a child, collecting shells like she'd done so many years before. Sully took photos of Eleanor with the lighthouse behind her, the wind blowing her gray hair, and thought she'd never looked more beautiful. They went to Pearl Harbor, standing at the memorial, thinking about how the war had started, how young they'd been, how much the world had changed. They held hands and remembered, grateful they'd survived when so many hadn't. Grace passed away in 1998 after a brief battle with cancer. Eleanor flew to California for the funeral, standing beside Ray as they said goodbye to her dear friend. Ray held Eleanor's hand during the service and whispered, "She loved you like a sister. You helped her survive the war. Thank you for that." Eleanor cried for days after coming home, grieving the loss of the friend who'd understood, like no one else, what they'd been through. Sully held her through it, understanding this particular grief, the loss of someone who'd shared such a formative experience. The new millennium arrived, and with it, new great-grandchildren. Eleanor and Sully's family had grown large and sprawling. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren starting to arrive. Family gatherings required renting halls, and keeping track of everyone's names was a challenge. But Sully and Eleanor were at the center of it all, the patriarch and matriarch, the love story that had started it all. Their children and grandchildren would ask them to tell the story of how they met, and they'd oblige, taking turns, finishing each other's sentences, adding details the other forgot. "Tell us about the war," the grandchildren would say, and Sully and Eleanor would share carefully chosen stories about courage and friendship, about letters that crossed oceans, about hope that sustained them through darkness, about love that made everything bearable. They didn't glorify war, they'd seen too much for that. But they helped their family understand why it had mattered, why people had fought, why the world they lived in had been shaped by those terrible years. In 2010, Sully fell and broke his hip. At 93, recovery was slow and difficult. Eleanor, 89 herself, but still sharp and determined, cared for him with the same competence she'd shown as a young nurse. She helped him with physical therapy, encouraged him when he grew frustrated, reminded him of his own advice from long ago. We survived the war. We can survive this too. He did survive it, though he never quite got back to full mobility. He needed a walker now, moved slowly, tired easily. But his mind was sharp, his humor intact, his love for Eleanor undimmed. They celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary in June 2010. The family threw a huge party, 3 generations gathering to honor the couple who'd built this family through love and determination. There were speeches and toasts, photos and laughter, grandchildren performing songs they'd written. Catherine stood up to speak, her own hair gray now, her own grandchildren sitting at her feet. "My parents," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "showed me what love looks like. Real love, the kind that lasts, not the easy kind you see in movies, but the kind that chooses the other person every single day. The kind that holds on through nightmares and memories and all the scars that war leaves behind. The kind that builds a life, raises children, creates a legacy." She looked at her parents, both of them crying now. "Thank you," she said, "for surviving, for finding each other, for showing all of us what it means to truly commit to another person, for building this family that we're all so proud to be part of." Eleanor and Sully held hands through the applause, through the hugs and tears and celebration. That night, back in their room at the care facility where they now lived, no longer able to manage their house alone, they lay in their separate beds, holding hands across the gap between them. 65 years, Sully said softly. "Can you believe it? It went by so fast," Eleanor replied. "And yet I remember everything, every moment with you." "Do you have any regrets?" Sully asked. Eleanor thought about this for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "Not one. I'd do it all again, exactly the same way, if it meant ending up here with you." "Me too," Sully said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. The war brought us together, but you're what made my life worth living." They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, 2 people who'd loved each other for 65 years, who'd survived a war and built a beautiful life in its aftermath. Sully passed away peacefully in his sleep in November 2012, 2 months shy of his 96th birthday. Eleanor was holding his hand when it happened, and she said later that his last words were, "I love you." The funeral was enormous, attended by hundreds of people whose lives Sully had touched. Veterans who remembered him from the war, customers from the bookshop, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, people who'd known him as a neighbor, a friend. A kind man who always had time to help. Eleanor sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children, dry-eyed and composed. She'd cried already in private, and now she wanted to celebrate the man Sully had been. At the reception after, she told stories that made people laugh. About his terrible singing voice, about the time he'd tried to surprise her by cooking dinner and nearly burned down the kitchen, about his habit of bringing home stray cats and pretending he'd found them at the bookshop when everyone knew he'd adopted them. "He was a good man," Eleanor said simply. "The best man I ever knew. And I was blessed to be his wife for 67 years. Eleanor lived 3 more years without Sully, staying in the care facility, surrounded by photos and memories. Her children visited regularly, brought the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about Sully, about the war, about the life they built. She wanted them to remember, to understand where they'd come from, what their grandparents had survived. On quiet evenings, she'd take out the letters, all of them, carefully preserved in boxes. Sully's letters from the war, her letters that he'd kept, the telegram announcing his crash, the pressed flower he'd sent her from France. She'd read through them slowly, hearing his voice in the words. Remembering the young man she'd fallen in love with, the life they'd built together. Grace and Ray visited her in dreams sometimes, along with the nurses she'd served with, the patients she'd cared for, all the ghosts from that long-ago war. They weren't frightening dreams. They were peaceful, gentle, like old friends saying hello. Eleanor passed away quietly in March 2015 at the age of 94. She died in her sleep, the way Sully had, peaceful and painless. Her children found her in the morning with a slight smile on her face, one hand stretched out as if reaching for someone. The funeral was held on a beautiful spring day, sunny and warm, flowers blooming everywhere. They buried her next to Sully, under a tree in the cemetery, their headstones side by side. Eleanor Walsh Sullivan, 1920-2015. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, nurse, healer, friend. She chose love every day. James Sully Sullivan, 1917-2012. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, pilot, bookseller, friend. He came home. Catherine stood with her siblings and her own children and grandchildren, looking at her parents' graves. "They're together now," she said, and somehow everyone knew it was true. Whatever came after death, wherever they were, Eleanor and Sully were together. Their story became family legend, passed down through the generations. The nurse and the pilot who met during World War II, who fell in love in the midst of horror, who built a life together that lasted nearly 7 decades, who showed their family what it meant to choose love, to commit fully, to build something lasting. Years later, Sarah, the granddaughter who'd taken over the bookshop, found a box in the store's office. Inside were all the letters, carefully preserved, along with photos and mementos from the war. There was a note in Eleanor's handwriting, dated just months before she died. "For whoever comes after," it read. "This is the story of how your great-grandfather and I fell in love. We were just 2 ordinary people, caught up in extraordinary times. The war could have destroyed us. Instead, it brought us together and taught us what really mattered. We built a life together, raised a family, and loved each other until the end. I hope you'll read these letters and understand that love, real love, the kind that chooses the other person every single day, is always worth fighting for, always worth waiting for, always worth protecting. Your great-grandfather used to say that I saved him during the war. But the truth is, we saved each other. And then we spent the rest of our lives grateful for that gift. May you find a love like ours. May you build a life that matters. May you remember where you came from and the people who fought for your freedom. With all my love, Grandma Eleanor. Sarah read the note with tears streaming down her face, then carefully put everything back in the box. This was her family's heritage, her grandparents' legacy. She donated the letters to the local historical society, where they were preserved and displayed, a testament to love in wartime, to survival against odds, to two people who found each other and held on. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in the bookshop, when the light slants through the windows just right, Sarah swears she can feel them there. Grandpa Sully recommending books to invisible customers. Grandma Eleanor checking on people with that nurturing warmth she never lost. Two spirits who loved each other so much that even death couldn't fully separate them. Their love story survived the war, survived decades of ordinary life, survived even death itself. Because love like that, true, deep, committed love, never really ends. It transforms into legacy, into memory, into the foundation that future generations build upon. Eleanor and Sully's story wasn't perfect. They had struggles and challenges, moments of doubt and pain, but they chose each other every single day for 67 years. They built a life. They raised a family. They made a difference. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To love deeply, to be loved fully in return, to build something lasting, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. Eleanor and Sully did all of that. They survived a war, found each other, and built a love story for the ages. And so ends the story of the nurse and the pilot. Two ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times and built an extraordinary life together. Their love sustained them through darkness and carried them into light. And their legacy lives on in the family they created, in the lives they touched, in the example they set. May we all be so lucky. May we all love so deeply. May we all build lives that matter. Rest now, dear listener. Let their story settle in your heart like a blessing. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Think of love that endures, of promises kept, of lives well lived. Eleanor and Sully found their way home to each other. And in the end, that's all that matters. Finding your way home. Finding your person. Finding your peace. Sleep deeply now. Dream of love stories and happy endings. Dream of ordinary days that add up to extraordinary lives. Dream of hope that never dies and love that never ends. Good night. Rest peacefully. And remember, love always wins if you're brave enough to fight for it.